Penguin Random House Audio presents The Cruelty is the Point, the past, present, and future of Trump's America. This is the author, Adam Serwer. For my grandparents, Zachary and Blanche, Drew and Dorothea. The Negro still hopes that someday the United States will become as great intellectually and morally as she is materially, to protect and honor all her citizens regardless of race, color, or previous condition, and thus make her professions a living reality. Ida B. Wells, May 28, 1894. A note to the reader. Throughout this book, I use lowercase when referring to racial terms such as black or white. This is against the prevailing trend in letters, but I do it because I fear that capitalization reinforces the notion that race is a biological reality rather than a social reality. Racism and bigotry are very real, but race itself is a biological fiction. Introduction. Promises made, promises kept. The day Donald Trump descended the golden escalator in Trump Tower in 2015 to announce his presidential campaign, he made a lot of promises. He said he was going to rebuild our infrastructure, our bridges, our roadways, our airports. He insisted that he would save Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security without cuts. He would reduce our $18 trillion in debt. The Affordable Care Act would be repealed and replaced with something much better for everybody. He promised to be the greatest jobs president that God ever created. America's politicians were controlled fully by the lobbyists, by the donors, and by the special interests, fully. But Trump would not be controlled. The media at the time covered the speech with headlines like "The 10 Best Lines from Donald Trump's Announcement Speech" and "The Best Moments from Donald Trump's Announcement Speech." An article in Politico gushed that it's hard to pick just 10. The Huffington Post announced that it was relegating coverage of Trump to its entertainment section. After all, this was the birtherism-spatting host of The Apprentice, a reality show star the sitting president had dismissed as a carnival barker. There was no way that Trump's overt bigotry, his demonizing of Latino immigrants as violent criminals and Muslims as terrorists, his caustic misogyny towards any woman with the temerity to criticize him, would fly in a nation that had just elected a black president, no matter what he was promising. A lot of very smart people treated Trump like the whole thing was a big joke. At the time, I was at the BuzzFeed News offices in New York City, standing around a television screen tuned to CNN with my colleagues. The grotesque tone of the Trump years was still new and hard to describe. Later, my colleague John Stanton, a tall, tattooed former bouncer who is as kind as he looks tough, said to me after attending a few of Trump's rallies, "I think he's going to be president." I was doubtful at the time. Remember, this was before Trump steamrolled a bunch of guys who generated a year's worth of magazine covers on the next Republican president. But what Stanton said stuck with me. Win or lose, the dust Trump was kicking up would linger in the lungs. I started poring over old texts about racism, immigration, and nativism, like John Higgins' Strangers in the Land. I found disturbing echoes of Trump's rhetorical style in Hannah Arendt's description of Stalinist and Nazi apparatchiks in The Origins of Totalitarianism, and had epiphanies about the fragility of American democracy reading W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America. Over the course of his presidency, I would write dozens of essays that drew on that history for The Atlantic, essays in which I tried to show how the ideological currents of the past had shaped the present. The realization dawned that Trump, win or lose, was summoning to the fore the most treacherous forces in American history and conducting them with the ease of a grand maestro. But could he win a Republican primary? For the previous 8 years, the GOP had piously espoused their small government fiscal conservatism in opposing Barack Obama. And here was a foul-mouthed, bombastic television personality who had a documented history of liberal policy positions on certain issues and no record of conservative achievement. Republican elites, elected officials, right-wing intellectuals, ambitious staffers denied that this heretic preacher could captivate their supposed small government flock with the gospel of white identity politics. They were wrong. They were wrong because they misunderstood their own base and the potency of Trump's appeal to a theme that would emerge more distinctly later in his general election campaign, the rigged system. Trump advisor Roger Stone urged Trump to espouse two simple claims: that the system is rigged against the citizens, and that, unlike other politicians, he cannot be bought. These themes were specific enough to be evocative, but vague enough to be misinterpreted. The rigged system was one thing to Trump supporters and another to many of the reporters, analysts, and intellectuals tasked with understanding what it meant. After Trump's unexpected victory, journalists attributed the win to his success in attacking an unfair economic system which had served so many millions of Americans poorly. The slow, grueling comeback from the 2008 recession, the magnitude of the housing crisis, the absence of wage growth, the plague of the opioid epidemic. These struggles and politicians' failure to address them effectively left the door open for an outsider who promised to fix them. Trump spoke often of these troubles as a candidate, but his presidency would reveal his true priorities. 5 years later, the legacy of Trump's presidency and his promises can be addressed. There was never an infrastructure bill. Trump's budgets consistently proposed cuts to the social programs he vowed not to touch. He did little to combat the opioid epidemic he promised to end, with deaths rising by the end of his tenure. The national debt Trump promised to erase has ballooned by almost $7.8 trillion. Trump's failed effort to repeal the Affordable Care Act and replace it with nothing remains the nadir of his public approval, surpassing even the days following his incitement of an armed attack on the Capitol building in an effort to overturn his 2020 election loss. Trump has the worst jobs record of any president since 1939, with more than 3 million lost. He is, in fact, the worst jobs president God ever created, despite inheriting an economy that had finally begun to boom in the later years of the Obama administration. The promises of better health care didn't materialize, and the job and wage growth from the economy he inherited were crushed by the pandemic he refused to address. Those were not the promises that Trump kept. Yet Trump's grip on the Republican Party is ironclad. The majority of conservative voters are devoted to the former president and echo both his intolerance for the slightest deviations from total obedience and his appetite for punishing dissenters. Lifelong Republican politicians who chose their duties over upholding Trump's will instantly found themselves inundated with harassment and threats of violence. Trump's word is truth hewn in stone, even if it contradicts something he said the day before. That doctrine is then amplified by a conservative media committed to ensuring their audience's fidelity to their leader at any cost, whether that means lying to them about a deadly pandemic or misleading them about the results of an election. Their gospel is as he tells it. Trump broke many of his policy promises, particularly those that diverged from Republican economic orthodoxy. But those policy promises weren't the only ones he made in that initial speech or elsewhere. His characterization of Mexican undocumented immigrants as rapists and drug dealers, his vows to ban Muslim travel to the United States, his undisguised contempt for Black Americans, these were also promises. They were promises to fight against a rigged system, not the one fixed in favor of the wealthy that Bernie Sanders railed against, but a different rigged system, one that elevated the unworthy over the worthy. This was a system that coddled undocumented Latino immigrants with benefits denied to citizens, a system that gave Black Americans undeserved benefits white Americans did not receive, a system that welcomed Middle Eastern refugees who would inevitably turn into terrorists while ignoring the people who, as the cliche goes, worked hard and played by the rules. It was a system in which you couldn't even talk frankly about crime or terrorism or religion without some mouthy liberal disagreeing or calling you racist. That was the system Trump's most committed supporters were angry about. It didn't matter that most of these grievances were false or, like political disagreement, part of living in a free society. What mattered was the sense of loss that accompanied the perception that a certain kind of conservative cultural and political hegemony was coming to an end. For millions whose identities became intertwined with Trump and his politics, that loss was embodied by the election of the first Black president and the possibility that Hillary Clinton might be his successor. But others were driven to Trump by the rapidity of recent cultural change, such as the swift acceptance of same-sex marriage, the vicarious thrill of watching Trump put ambitious women in their place, the growing diversity of their cities and towns, or simply the fact that the things Donald Trump was saying, things that made perfect sense to them, were greeted with outrage. Faced with the existential threat posed by their fellow citizens, anything Trump might do, no matter how lawless, destructive, or cruel, was justified. Trump didn't need to read William F. Buckley, Edmund Burke, or Russell Kirk to understand how to appeal to American conservatives.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?